June 26th, 1943. We are not on the ground, but 25,000 feet above occupied France, in the frozen, airless heart of the Second World War's most brutal aerial front. This is the epicenter of the strategic bombing campaign, a relentless, 24-hour assault designed to break the industrial spine of the Third Reich. Below, B-17 bombers lumber toward their targets. Around them, a swirling, chaotic melee of fighters. And in the center of it all, Captain Robert S. Johnson is fighting for his life. He struggles to control his P-47 Thunderbolt as a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 systematically, almost surgically, dismantles it. This is not a dogfight. It is an execution. 200 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition, shells designed to explode on impact, pierce the Thunderbolt's fuselage. The cockpit erupts. The armored glass canopy shatters into 1,000 flying daggers. Metal and glass fragments tear through Johnson's flight suit, wounding his body. Shrapnel lodges in his forehead, cheek, and shoulder. His flight controls are dying. The instrument panel is a smoking ruin. By every known standard of aviation, by every law of physics and warfare, Robert Johnson should be dead. His plane, the Pint, should be a flaming comet plunging into the French countryside. And against all conceivable odds, Robert Johnson will fly that mutilated 8-ton wreck back through 200 miles of hostile territory and land it in England. This is the story of the hardest-to-kill pilot of World War II and the extraordinary machine that simply, stubbornly, refused to die. To understand the miracle of June 26th, one must first understand the man. Robert Samuel Johnson was born on February 21st, 1920, in Lorton, Oklahoma. He was a child of the Great Depression, the son of a farmer battling not an enemy military, but the earth itself, as relentless dust storms ravaged the Great Plains. Life was defined by scarcity. Money was rare, and hardship was a daily companion. But in that crucible of poverty and drought, Robert forged the characteristics that would later define him in combat. Unyielding resilience, quiet determination,
Thunderbolt, known
and an absolute, iron-willed refusal to give up. Like many young men of his era, Robert was mesmerized by aviation. He devoured every airplane magazine, his fingers meticulously assembling model planes from balsa wood. He dreamed of flying, a dream that seemed utterly impossible for a poor farm boy from Oklahoma. Then, a single date changed the world. December 7th, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was thrust into a global conflict. The arsenal of democracy roared to life, and the Army Air Force suddenly, desperately, needed pilots. Robert Johnson enlisted immediately. He tore through flight training, his instructors noting a rare combination of gifts. He possessed natural talent, instinctive coordination, and superior spatial judgment. But most importantly, he had the single most critical quality for a fighter pilot: controlled aggression. Johnson wasn't reckless, but he was utterly determined. When he acquired a target, he did not let go. In January 1943, now Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson arrived in a cold, damp England. He was assigned to the 61st Fighter Squadron, part of the legendary 56th Fighter Group. And here, he met the aircraft that would define his life. It was the heaviest and most powerful single-engine fighter in the Allied arsenal, an 8-ton behemoth powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. It was, in short, a monster. Pilots, Johnson included, had an immediate and complex love-hate relationship with the Thunderbolt. It was simply enormous. In a sky populated by sleek, agile interceptors like the Spitfire, the P-47 was a brute. The cockpit was perched so high off the ground that pilots needed a ladder to climb in. Its critics, and there were many, pointed to its sluggishness. It took an eternity to climb to combat altitude, a critical disadvantage when Luftwaffe fighters could bounce them from above. In a close quarters, turning maneuver a traditional dogfight with an agile German fighter, the P-47 was a distinct second best. But what it lacked in balletic grace, it more than compensated for with overwhelming advantages. It was, first and foremost, built like a flying tank. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, had prioritized protection and redundancy in every system. He understood the strategic reality. America was fighting a war thousands of miles from home. It could replace aircraft, but it could not easily replace trained pilots. The cockpit was an armored bathtub, protecting the man inside. The massive R2800 radial engine acted as its own shield, capable of absorbing damage that would shatter the liquid-cooled inline engines of its German counterparts. And then, there was its power. In a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. No German fighter could follow a Thunderbolt at full throttle, plunging toward the Earth. This speed, combined with its devastating firepower of 8 50 caliber machine guns, made it a terrifying weapon. Robert Johnson adapted his entire combat philosophy to this reality. He learned to be a tactician, not just a pilot. He used its advantages, its bone-shattering speed, its diving capability, and its overwhelming firepower. He learned to avoid its weaknesses, refusing to be drawn into turning engagements where more agile German fighters held the advantage. This was the new face of aerial warfare, not the romantic duels of the First World War, but high-speed, high-stakes energy combat. The 56th Fighter Group's primary mission was a brutal, nerve-shredding grind. Bomber escorts. They were the little friends, flying protection for the vast, vulnerable formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators. This was the sharp end of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, a doctrine built on the theory that relentless daylight bombing could cripple German war production. But the theory was failing, because the bombers were being slaughtered, unescorted. They were prey. The P-47, with its impressive range using external fuel tanks, was the first fighter capable of accompanying them deep into hostile territory. The work was beyond dangerous. It was a daily confrontation with mortality. The Luftwaffe's Reichsverteidigung, defense of the Reich. Pilots were skilled, experienced, and fighting for their homeland. They attacked the fat cow bombers with suicidal aggression, and layered beneath the fighter-on-fighter chaos was the flak. German anti-aircraft fire created terrifying curtains of exploding metal, turning patches of sky into no-go zones, where survival was a matter of pure chance. Each mission meant hours spent flying over hostile territory, where a single mistake, a single mechanical failure, meant death or capture. In his first 10 missions, Robert Johnson proved he was born for this. He demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of America's greatest aces. He was aggressive, but disciplined. He attacked when he held the advantage and had the wisdom to retreat when he didn't. He fiercely protected his wingmen, a trait that earned him unwavering loyalty. And he possessed exceptional vision. He frequently spotted enemy fighters long before anyone else in his formation. A sixth sense that gave his unit a crucial, life-saving advantage. But on June 26, 1943, during his 27th mission, Robert Johnson would face a test that would define not only his career, but the very legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. What happened that day would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the history of aerial warfare. June 26, 1943, 4. The mission began, as it always did, in the cold, damp dark of Halesworth, England, home of the 56th Fighter Group. Low fog clung to the English countryside. Pilots were roused for a 5 briefing. The tone was professional, grim, and focused. Today's mission was a deep penetration strike. The objective: escorting B-17 bombers to attack German industrial facilities near Paris. This was not a simple milk run. It was a high-risk operation, striking deep into the heart of occupied territory. Robert Johnson calmly moved through the pre-mission rituals, a set of actions designed to impose order on a fundamentally chaotic profession. He meticulously checked his flight equipment: suit, parachute, survival pistol, first aid kit. He ate a light breakfast. Experience had taught the pilots that a full stomach at high altitude, under the crushing G-forces of combat, was a recipe for nausea. He walked out to his P-47, serial number 42 to 8487, which he had nicknamed Half Pint. To any observer, it was a standard production aircraft. But to Johnson, after 26 missions, it was an extension of himself. He knew its quirks, how the engine performed best with specific mixture settings, how the controls grew heavy above 25,000 feet, how it tended to pull slightly right in a high-speed dive. Man and machine had become a single weapon system. Takeoff was at 6:45. 56 P-47 seconds of the 56th Group thundered into the air, forming up over England before heading across the English Channel. They were the muscle, the guardians. Over the French coast, they met their charges. 60 B-17 flying fortresses, cruising in tight box formations, each laden with tons of high explosives. The Thunderbolts took up their escort positions, some high as top cover, some on the flanks, some trailing behind, weaving to guard the vulnerable rear. The first hour was deceptively quiet. Occasional bursts of flak dotted the sky, but they were inaccurate, exploding into black puffs far from the formation. No enemy fighters appeared. A rookie pilot might have relaxed, but Robert Johnson knew better. The Germans were masters of the ambush. They often waited, letting the Allied formations push deep into occupied territory, far from home, burning precious fuel before they pounced. At 9:20, 60 miles southeast of Paris, the trap was sprung. First, Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds plunged from high altitude, diving through the bomber boxes. Then, the deadly Focke-Wulf W190 seconds hit the flanks. The sky exploded into a three-dimensional battlefield. Red and orange tracers streaked in all directions. Explosions of flak and impacted bombers dotted the space between the dueling aircraft. Robert Johnson reacted instantly, diving his P-47 onto a Bf-109 that was lining up behind a straggling B-17. His 8.50 caliber machine guns roared, a torrent of lead that converged on the German fighter. Impacts glittered on the 109's wing. The German aircraft rolled violently and plunged toward the earth, a long tail of black smoke marking its demise. Johnson didn't follow it down. His mission was not to hunt for personal glory. It was to protect the bombers. He pulled back up, returning to the formation. And that's when he saw trouble. Two FOV 192s were preying on a B-17 that had fallen out of formation, its engine damaged. Robert immediately dove to intercept, his P-47 accelerating like a thrown javelin. He positioned himself behind the nearest few 190 and opened fire. The German pilot, seeing the tracers, broke hard. Robert followed, but the few 190 was more agile in a tight turn. The German rolled, dived, and pulled up. Robert tried to follow, but the P-47 was too heavy. And in that moment, Johnson made a critical, near-fatal mistake. Focused entirely on the target ahead, he lost his situational awareness. He didn't see the second few 190 maneuvering onto his tail. He didn't realize he had strayed too far from the main formation. He was isolated, vulnerable, and about to pay a terrible price. His first warning was the sound. A sound no pilot ever wants to hear. The rapid, hollow crack, crack, crack of 20mm cannons impacting metal. He instantly threw the controls forward and to the side, diving and rolling. But it was too late. The German pilot was an expert. He was
the embodiment
spraying.
of the new Luftwaffe.
He was aiming.
Precise and utterly
Explosive rounds ripped through the right wing of the half-pint. The acrylic canopy shattered. Robert felt the sharp, searing pain as shrapnel cut through his flight suit, piercing his forehead, cheek, and shoulder. Blood streamed into his eyes. The icy 25,000-foot wind howled through the ruined cockpit. He dived steeply, the speed climbing dramatically. 400 miles per hour, 450, 480. The P-47 was vibrating, on the edge of structural failure. Johnson expected the German to break off. Most pilots would have. But this one was different. He pursued relentlessly, firing burst after burst. More impacts hammered the Thunderbolt. The instrument panel exploded in sparks and shattered glass. Half the gauges were dead. Smoke filled the cockpit. Robert was flying blind, blood in his eyes, smoke obscuring his vision, the shattered canopy distorting his view. The German continued his methodical execution, tearing apart the hydraulic system, puncturing fuel tanks, shredding control surfaces. The half-pint was being torn apart in mid-air. Johnson tried everything: violent rolls, steep climbs, scissor maneuvers. Nothing worked. The German stayed glued to him, firing. He was an exceptional pilot, and he had Robert at his mercy. The controls grew heavy, then nearly unresponsive. The right aileron was gone. Control cables were cut. Robert was no longer defending himself. He was just a passenger in a dying machine. Then, silence. The German guns stopped. Robert looked back through the smoke and debris. The few 190 was still there, flying alongside him, so close Robert could see the pilot. They made eye contact. The German looked at the devastated P-47, then at the bleeding Johnson. Then, he did something unbelievable. He saluted a pilot-to-pilot acknowledgement, rolled over, and dived away. Perhaps he was out of ammunition. Perhaps he simply concluded that Johnson was doomed. Or perhaps it was a rare act of warrior's respect. Whatever the reason, Robert was alone. But his situation was desperate. He was 200 miles behind enemy lines, in a plane that was more whole than aircraft, wounded, bleeding, and flying blind. The odds of survival were zero. But Robert Johnson wasn't about to give up. They called the P-47 indestructible. Robert Johnson was about to test that theory. He took stock of his situation. The assessment was catastrophic. Blood was a constant, warm trickle into his eyes from the wounds on his head. His right shoulder burned. The icy, thin wind of high altitude howled through the shattered void where his canopy had been, a 30-degree gale that made breathing a conscious effort. His fingers were already going numb. The plane was in even worse condition. Through the smoke, blood, and distorted vision, he could see massive holes puncturing the right wing. The fuselage behind him, he would later learn, looked like Swiss cheese, perforated by dozens of 20mm cannon holes. Hydraulic fluid streamed past him, staining the fuselage, a clear indicator his systems were bleeding out. The instrument panel was a smoldering ruin. Of his 23 gauges, only 3 basic instruments still functioned: a compass, an altimeter, and an airspeed indicator. Everything else was dead.
Feet,
the controls were not just heavy,
could drop to 40
they were
below
borderline useless. The right aileron was unresponsive, its cables clearly severed. The rudder was locked, its hydraulic cylinders destroyed. To keep the wings level, Robert had to use brute, agonizing force with both hands, physically fighting the aircraft's desire to roll over and die. Every minor course correction required his entire upper body strength. Worse, he was lost. The chaotic, spinning dogfight had left him completely disoriented, somewhere southeast of Paris,
symbolized the heavy
200
cost
miles
of the
from
mission.
home. If he flew the wrong way, he would end up deeper in occupied France, or worse, over Germany itself. He would run out of fuel and be forced to land in enemy territory. He made a decision. It was primitive, but it was all he had. He would use the sun. The sun was in the west. England was to the northwest. He would turn the wrecked P-47 so that the sun was slightly to his right and hold that course. That turn was a nightmare. With damaged controls, he had to carefully coordinate his few working systems: throttle, left aileron, and brute force to bank the plane. The P-47 protested, threatening to roll violently. His arms were already trembling, on fire from the strain. He had to manage his own failing body. The blood loss was making him dizzy. He used one hand to press his gauze-wrapped first aid kit against the wound on his forehead while piloting one-handed, alternating when his arms grew too tired to continue. He had to keep the blood out of his eyes. Altitude was another problem. He was at 22,000 feet, but the extreme cold was draining his body of heat. He needed to descend to warmer, denser air. But doing so would make him a target for the thousands of German flak batteries that blanketed all of occupied France. He compromised, descending gradually to 15,000 feet, low enough for warmth, high enough, he prayed, to avoid the worst of the ground fire. Each minute felt like an hour. His arms burned. The cold seeped through his flight suit, and he began to shiver uncontrollably. After an eternity, only 20 minutes in reality, he saw it. The French coast, that distinct, beautiful line between land and sea. He was on the right heading. Now, a new desert, the English Channel, 80 miles of cold, gray water. If the engine failed, if the controls finally gave way, if he passed out, he would plunge into the sea and drown. There were no emergency airfields here. It was all or nothing. He crossed the French coast, and just as he'd feared, the coastal flak batteries opened up. Black explosions bloomed around him. But in his crippled plane, any violent turn would mean a complete loss of control. He had no choice but to fly straight and level, a sitting duck, relying on altitude alone. Flak shrapnel glittered against his already mutilated fuselage. A few more holes wouldn't make a difference. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the half-pint's heart, continued to beat. It was a testament to its robust radial design. Cylinders were almost certainly damaged. It was running rough, vibrating the entire airframe. But it continued to generate power. 30 minutes over the water. 40. England had to be there. But all he saw was more gray water. A flicker of doubt, of despair. Had he misjudged? Then, through the fog and the blood in his eyes, he saw it. A dark line on the horizon. Land. The English coast. He had crossed the channel. He was back in friendly territory. He wasn't safe, not by a long shot, but he was home. Now, he just had to land. Robert Johnson flew the half-pint over the English coast. A ghost returning from the dead. British anti-aircraft batteries tracked the battered American fighter, but held their fire. They recognized the P-47's silhouette, and even from the ground, the catastrophic damage was evident. Johnson needed an airfield, and he needed one now. His fuel gauge was among the dead instruments. He was flying on borrowed time, with no idea if he had minutes or seconds before the engine finally starved. He spotted an airfield below. It wasn't his home base of Halesworth, but it didn't matter. It was a runway, and it was English. It was Manston, a coastal emergency base. Its entire purpose to receive shattered aircraft like his. He tried the radio, but the system was as dead as his instrument panel. Another victim of the 20mm cannon fire. He signaled his emergency in the most primitive way possible, by rocking his wings.
As
on the
war
ground,
raged across the continent,
personnel understood
life in the
immediately.
small English villages
A flaming
continued.
meatball landing was coming in. Fire trucks and ambulances scrambled, racing into position near the runway. The control tower cleared all air traffic. Robert Johnson was cleared to land. Now, a new, desperate battle began. The fight against his own aircraft. First, the landing gear. Normally, a simple hydraulic lever. But his hydraulic system was a memory. Its fluid smeared across 200 miles of sky. He had to use the emergency backup, a manual hand pump. It required 100 physical pumps to mechanically lower the wheels. With one hand locked in a death grip on the controls, fighting to keep the plane level, Robert used the other to pump the emergency lever. Pump, pump, pump. Each stroke was an agony. His wounded shoulder screamed. His arm, already burning from the strain of flying, felt like lead. Sweat mingled with the drying blood on his face. 50 pumps. 75. 90. Finally, he felt the heavy thud as the landing gear locked into place. Or at least, he hoped it had. He had no working indicator lights. He didn't know if all 3 wheels were down or just some.
Scramble!
He would find out
Those
on
engines
impact.
started now.
Lining up for final approach was a pilot's nightmare.
Flaming meatball.
The controls were so heavy
Crash landing.
that fine adjustments were impossible. The P-47, with its shattered right aileron, fought him constantly, trying to pull to the right. He had to use almost full left rudder and aileron just to keep the wings level, a balancing act that consumed all his remaining strength. He was descending too fast, but he had no flaps. The hydraulic system that operated them was also gone. 300 yards from the runway, 200, 100. The ground rushed up. Robert hauled back on the controls, trying to flare to slow the descent. The P-47, a heavy, uncooperative brick, resisted. 50 yards, 25. The wheels slammed onto the tarmac with a brutal, bone-jarring thud. The impact was so strong, Robert bit his tongue, his mouth filling with the coppery taste of blood. But the wheels held. All 3 had deployed. The Thunderbolt bounced, but it was down. It tore down the runway, slowing, but not slowing enough. Robert stomped on the brakes. Nothing. Like all the other hydraulic systems, they were dead. He cut the engine, and the propeller spun to a halt. He let the half-pint roll, using only air resistance to slow its massive weight. It finally coasted to a stop 2,000 feet down the track. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. After 2 hours of the deafening roar of the engine, the howl of the wind, and the chatter of gunfire, the sudden, absolute silence was shocking. Robert tried to move. His muscles refused to respond. His arms were locked in the position of gripping the controls, and he had to physically, consciously, force his fingers to unclench. Fire trucks and ambulances swarmed the aircraft. Paramedics climbed onto the wing, prying open the ruined canopy. They stopped, stunned by what they saw. Robert was covered in blood. His flight suit was torn. The cockpit interior looked like a bomb had detonated inside it, a maelstrom of shattered glass, twisted metal, and destroyed instruments. "Christ," one of the medics murmured. "How in God's name are you still alive?" Robert tried to answer, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. "The plane! Check the plane." They gently lifted him from the cockpit, a body broken but not beaten, and laid him on a stretcher. As they carried him to the ambulance, Robert turned his head to look back at the half-pint one last time. What he saw, even through his exhaustion and pain, shocked him. The P-47 looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. The right wing was riddled with over 20 gaping holes. The fuselage was peppered with hundreds of perforations. The canopy was gone. Fluids leaked from a dozen different systems, pooling on the tarmac. It was a miracle that this collection of damaged parts had flown at all, let alone carried him 200 miles across the channel. He was alive.
Oh God.
He had survived the impossible. While doctors at the Manston Base Hospital worked to stabilize Robert Johnson, treating multiple lacerations, a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, and a concussion, a team of mechanics and engineers began a detailed inspection of the half-pint. What they
I've never
discovered
seen
was
one
not
make it
just
back in
an
this condition.
aircraft.
Look at the stabilizer.
It was an
Completely shot out.
artifact, a case study in survival that would fundamentally alter engineering philosophies. The maintenance chief, Major Thomas, personally led the
This
inspection,
footage captures the
his
remarkable
team
resilience
marking
of the
every
P-47
single impact
Thunderbolt,
point with
the
chalk.
Pint. After
The final
sustaining heavy
tally was
damage,
extraordinary and alarming. 21 distinct 20mm explosive cannon holes and over 200 machine gun perforations. The sheer concentration of damage was unlike anything they had ever seen on an aircraft that hadn't disintegrated.
Thank you, nurse.
The report they
Well, that's
compiled
heavy.
reads like an autopsy of a machine that refused to die. The canopy was a complete write-off, shattered by multiple impacts. The armored seat back had stopped several
I don't know how
rounds
she
that
made
would
it
have
back.
otherwise
Look at this
passed
fuselage.
through Johnson's torso.
Completely shredded.
The instrument panel was a melted, shattered ruin. Of 23 instruments, only 3 had remained functional. The hydraulic system was a total loss, its reservoir punctured and lines severed in 8 different places. Johnson had flown home with no flaps, no brakes, and had lowered his gear with a manual hand pump. The flight controls were a miracle. The right aileron cables were 90% severed, held together by only a few strands of wire. The rudder system was compromised, the elevator cables damaged. A few more cut wires, and the half-pint would have become completely uncontrollable. But the star of the report was the Pratt &
canopy
Whitney
of the half-pint,
R2800
ripped apart by
engine.
A stark
It had
reminder
taken
of the
multiple
dangers
direct
faced by the
hits.
bomber crews in 1944.
3 cylinders were completely destroyed, pistons seized, blocks cracked. 4 others showed partial damage. Of the original 18 cylinders, only 11 were functioning when Johnson landed. And yet, this crippled, vibrating power plant had generated enough consistent power to haul the 8-ton fighter 200 miles home. It was the ultimate validation of the robust radial engine design,
This
an
is the
inline,
Double-Wasp,
liquid-cooled
the
engine,
R2800.
like that in a Spitfire or Bf-109, would have failed catastrophically with a single puncture to its cooling system. The fuel tanks, though punctured, had worked exactly as designed. The self-sealing rubber bladders had expanded to plug the holes, preventing a fatal fuel leak. Major Thomas's conclusion was stark. The aircraft had suffered the most extensive combat damage ever documented on any P-47 that remained flyable.
The most
He
extensive
declared that its
combat
return
damage
was an
ever
extraordinary
documented.
testament to both the robustness of the aircraft's design and the exceptional skill of the pilot. Initially declared a total loss, the half-pint was given a reprieve. The decision was made to rebuild it. It would not just be an aircraft, but a symbol.
Gentlemen, this
It
engine
would
is
be
your
used for
lifeblood.
training,
And remember, the
a
P-47
tangible,
may be heavy, but she's
patched-up
built
lesson,
like a tank.
showing new pilots exactly how much punishment their aircraft could absorb and still bring them home. While his plane was being resurrected, Robert Johnson was in a different kind of battle. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering, but the physical injuries were the least of his worries. He had endured 15 minutes of systematic execution. He had flown for 2 hours, bleeding and partially blind, in a plane that should have been his coffin. That kind of trauma scars a man. He had recurring nightmares, waking up to the sound of German cannons. Doctors recognized the symptoms of what we now call PTSD, then bluntly labeled combat fatigue. They offered him a ticket home, a permanent grounding. Robert refused. "I'm not finished yet," he told the physician. "I have a score to settle." After 2 weeks, he returned to flight status. His commander, the legendary Colonel Hubert Zemke, leader of the 56th Group, called him in. Zemke, a hard-bitten realist, knew the toll of combat. "Bob," he said, "you don't need to prove a damn thing. What you survived. Nobody would expect you to go back up." Robert's reply was simple. "I want to fly, sir." Zemke studied him, then nodded. "You'll fly, but we start slow." His first missions back were agonizing. Every sighting of an FW-190, every burst of flak, made his muscles tense, his scars itch. He had to consciously force his hands to remain steady. But gradually, his confidence, rooted in his innate skill, returned. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a survivor. The trauma never disappeared, but he learned to manage it, to channel it. He began to
Lieutenant
accumulate
Johnson
victories.
proudly displays the sign of
In
an ace,
August,
having
he shot
secured
down
his
2
fifth victory
BF,
that morning.
109 seconds. In September, he destroyed an FW-190, the same type that had nearly ended him. Each victory was a step back from the brink. In December 1943, Robert Johnson officially became an ace, with 5 confirmed victories. He had been to hell and returned, not just to fly, but to fight and to win. Robert Johnson's return to combat was not just a recovery, it was a campaign. He would go on to fly a full tour of duty and then sign up for another.
We're proud
The
of you.
man who had been systematically executed over France, who had been offered a medical discharge, became one of the most feared and respected hunters in the European theater. When he finally returned to the United States in 1944,
We were flying so low
Robert
the
S.
cows were
Johnson
looking
was
up
the
at us.
second highest scoring American ace in Europe,
now, sir. You
with
didn't actually
27
buzz the
confirmed
tower.
aerial victories.
Ground crew dubbed
Only
her the
Francis
Swiss
Gabby
cheese.
Gabreski, his
With over
squadron mate
1,000
in the
holes,
56th,
the odds of
had
survival
more.
were almost zero.
It was an extraordinary record, but Johnson's true contribution to the war effort was far greater than a number. His experience on June 26, 1943, became a living, breathing case study in multiple, critical aspects of aerial warfare. For pilots, it became a legend, a story passed from veteran to rookie. It demonstrated that survival was possible in situations that seemed utterly hopeless. Never give up became a visceral mantra in the 56th Group. Remember what Johnson survived was the new standard for tough. For the engineers at Republic Aviation, the half pint provided invaluable, priceless data on survivability. They analyzed every perforation, every severed cable, every destroyed cylinder. This was not a theoretical stress test. It was the ultimate field report. Several critical improvements were incorporated into later P-47 models based directly on this analysis.
P-47 Thunderbolt
Cockpit
dominated
armor
the
was
skies of
reinforced.
World War II.
System redundancy,
Decades later,
which had saved Johnson's life, was increased, with more systems given emergency manual backups. The R-2800 radial engine's reputation for indestructibility was permanently cemented. The data proved that the design philosophy
For
of Alexander
extraordinary
Kartveli,
heroism.
prioritizing pilot protection and robust systems over marginal gains in speed or agility, was the correct strategy for a long, attritional war. This philosophy has a direct lineage. It traces from the P-47 Thunderbolt to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, a modern ground attack aircraft built around the same principles, a titanium armored bathtub for the pilot, and redundant systems designed to fly home, no matter what. After the war, Robert Johnson returned to the United States as a hero, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross. But true to his modest Oklahoman roots, He deflected credit.
To the finest
I was
fighter group in
lucky,
the 8th Air Force.
he would say. Lucky to have that plane. Lucky the German ran out of ammunition. He worked as a test pilot for Republic, helping to develop the next generation of jet fighters, before becoming a successful executive in the aerospace industry. He lived until 1998, passing away at 78. At his funeral, former P-47 pilots, now old men, came from all over the country. They shared a common story, how Johnson's impossible flight had given them courage when their own planes were shot down, how it had inspired them to keep fighting to get home. Today, more than 80 years later, the story of Robert Johnson and the half-pint endures. It is taught in engineering courses at military academies. It is studied by pilots. It resonates because it is a perfect synthesis of human and mechanical resilience. It is a reminder that good design, a philosophy that values the human operator, saves lives. It is a reminder that the human spirit, forged in the hardships of the Great Depression and tempered in the fires of combat, can endure more than we think possible. Robert Johnson taught the world two things. First, that the P-47 was an incredible plane that could bring its pilot home from the gates of hell. And second, that the will to survive is the most powerful component in any weapon system.